Yes, take you to that briefing where Minister of Electricity Dr Kgosientsho Ramokgopa is currently going to be briefing on Eskom. Let's listen in.
And once more, good afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much for making time to join us this afternoon at this press conference. So the intention really is not to repeat the opening remarks, it's just to highlight the significance of this Energy Indaba. Africa Energy Indaba. I'm advised that it is on its 17th edition, so the 17th installment of the Africa Energy Indaba. Just two transversal issues that, in my opinion, requires attention. The first one is that we are experiencing a situation where the geopolitical issues are becoming more and more fluid. We are seeing that there's minerals nationalization, issues of protectionism, like I said earlier on, the weaponization of trade. I think requires that Africa must have an honest conversation with itself. And I think the energy complex is able to surface in the most acute fashion some of these manifestations of first the political economy of energy, but also its geopolitical manifestations. That although Africa is the most mineral rich of all continents, yet it is the most energy deprived of all these continents, the most underdeveloped, the poorest of all the regions. And the point we're making is that it is important that in the context of the conversations around the critical minerals and the transition to cleaner forms of energy, we take stock of the possibilities for the continent. That some of these minerals that are going to anchor and underpin these transitions are found in the main on the continent. But the biggest challenge that is confronting us is the ability to finance this kind of the investments that are required for us to be able to realize the potential of the continent. So the issues of the financing gap should be issues that is front and center of the conversation. And we are calling for a number of steps to be taken, including but not limited to the need to reconfigure the cost of capital. And our view is that developing nations face exorbitant borrowing costs due to the perceived risks that do not reflect economic fundamentals, but rather outdated and what I refer to as biased credit ratings. So it's important that issues of risk allocation should be assigned to parties that have got the best capability of resolving that risk amongst others. And the issues of expanding the fiscal space, we do accept that the debt burdens that are placed on the African countries are crippling and undermine their ability to invest in issues of development, issues around climate resilience and clean energy transitions. So of course this is what sovereign nations need to do to ensure that we are able to use the country's balance sheet to the extent that is possible to enable the investments that are required in this space. And then we are advocating for greater coordination between the financial actors. So what you see is that there's some degree of asymmetry and fragmentation. The multilateral development banks on the one side, the development finance institutions on the other, and issues around the vertical climate funds. And what this does is because they are some degree of misalignment, so it undermines the possibility of us achieving greater efficiencies, and this is going to hinder impact of the pockets of fund that these players are bringing to the fore to help to anchor, if you like, this kind of transitions and the issues of sustainable development, the ability of the continent to extract and beneficiate closer to source, and thereby broadening the industrial flow of their respective jurisdictions. And then there's a need for us to strengthen the role of national development banks. Where they exist, I think there's a need for recapitalization especially here in South Africa. I think the DBSA can play a much, much bigger role if it's recapitalized, so that, I mean, it competes with some of your commercial banks, and therefore they are unable to provide the kind of concessionality that is associated with development banks, and therefore it stands or undermine, if you like, the prospect of them anchoring the kind of industries that we want to see, because they must compete with the commercial banks on the same rates. And then there's a need to work very hard to attract private sector investments. Of course, this is also a function of issues of political stability, leadership questions, the function of the deepening of democracy, the ossification of the foundations of democracy that will give a market the necessary confidence for them to invest on the continent. And of course, this requires that the political actors, the elected representatives, should work very hard to ensure that there's a degree of stability at the political level, but create the necessary conditions, introduce the kind of reforms that are necessary to spur on private sector investment. So those are some of the interventions that they were proposing for us to be able to realize the potential of the continent. And then the second major issue is that of South Africa's presidency of the G20. As you will know, that we are the first sovereign country on the continent. First, we are the only sovereign country on the continent that is a full member of the G20. And of course, by virtue of us being the president of the G20, then the continent gets a first opportunity to host this august platform of the G20. It's also instructive that we are taking over from Brazil, which is a peer country on the south, because I think what Brazil had done very well was to elevate the issues around clean cooking, those issues that are associated with developing countries. So we're not about to stunt that momentum. If anything, we'll make sure that we catalyze that momentum of surfacing and elevating those issues that are uniquely of developing countries. So we want to champion that agenda as South Africa. And of course, it gets to be codified in our priority areas as a energy technical working group. We have agreed on 3 priorities. And these priorities, I must hasten to add, have been sufficiently canvassed with my peers on the continent. We use the occasion of the platform of the AU for us to invite member countries, member states to be part of this conversation. And I'm happy that there was a unanimous acceptance on these 3 priorities for energy. The first one is on energy security and forging affordable and reliable access. So we make the point that access is a big part of the conversation on the continent. We make the point that 43% of the total population don't have access to electricity. In global terms, 600 million of the 680 million people globally who don't have access to electricity are found here on the continent. That is 83% of the global population that don't have access to electricity. So it's a big issue. So before you talk about transitioning, people need to have access to whatever electricity, irrespective of what is the fuel sources are. I'll tell you why that is important, because you can't go into an area, a village that doesn't have access to electricity, they have not been connected to electricity, and you start talking of a transition. The only transition they want is from darkness to light. And what anchors the fuel source, it's a secondary conversation. But we are not about to abrogate our responsibility. We have committed as a country, and I think as a continent, we bear the responsibility to ensure that we are able to provide this access in a manner that doesn't degrade the environment. And also it keep to our obligations to ensure that we reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. Although we contribute I think less than 2.5% of the total CO2 emissions. And of course, we do think that going into the future, that gas will still be part of the mix on the continent. And then the second one of the priorities that we are elevating as a country under our presidency is to achieve what we call just, affordable, and inclusive energy transitions with an S at the end. That is important because we are of the opinion that there is no single transition. I think any transition should take account of the unique circumstances of individual countries, the pace and scale that they can afford. And that's why also there's conversations, very live conversations here, robust here in the country in relation to how we want to manage that transition. Of course, we'll be releasing the integrated resource plan is now sitting with NEDLAC, so we hope that in the next month or so, it will be out in the public domain, and that will explain how we see these transitions unfolding here in the country. And the last one of the three priorities is African interconnectivity and energy pools. We think that the ambitions of achieving a single electricity market on the continent is not far-fetched. For us to be able to have universal access by 2063 as advocated for in Agenda 2063, and it makes a point that we can achieve that through regional integration, that there has to be significant investment on interconnectivity. Again, I accept the fact that it's capital hungry, it's going to require an enormous amount of investment. I mean, just to use the South Africa's experience as a case study, is that our own transmission development plan suggests that we need to expand and modernize the grid 14,000 kilometers in the next 10 years. We require upwards of 440 billion rands to achieve that. The fiscus sovereign balance sheet won't be able to carry that. The Eskom balance sheet is not sufficient for reasons that are apparent to all of us. So it's important that we are able to find a bespoke financing instruments to make this possible. And of course, I mean, you can go to other regions on the continent. I'm sure they'll be confronted with the same challenge. So yes, we are looking to ensure that we were able to achieve this African interconnectivity. And you know that we expect the increase in electricity trade volumes to grow by about 300% by 2040. And by that time, the projection is that Africa's population will be about 2 billion people from the current 1.5 billion. And for us to be able to achieve this level of ambition, you can imagine that there's a huge investments that are required for us to achieve this. One of the studies done by some of the reputable international organizations suggests that Africa will need upwards of 2.6 trillion rands of investments in the energy sector by 2040. So we can see that the pool of financing is enormous. I mean, even if you had to consolidate the balance sheet of the continent, I don't think we are going to get anywhere close to raising this money. And that's why it's important that we are able to design financing instruments that will make it possible for us to achieve this level of ambition. So in closing, we really think that a conference of this nature, because it examines all types of energy sources, is going to help us not just to answer the question of resource endowments that for all of us, and we know about that. So we want to move from resource to reserve to exploiting those and ensuring that it helps in powering the, if you like, the re-emergence of the continent as a major player on the global map from an energy perspective. And with the current known levels of reserves, or if you like, endowments, there's no reason why Africa should be left behind. We have no time. I think that's the point I was trying to convey. I mean, there's no time for us to prevaricate. We have talked about these issues. We have diagnosed the problem. I think we're at the level where we need to ensure that there's sufficient action to respond to these challenges. Some of the major Western powers have shown us that the conversation and issues around diplomacy and foreign policy is a function of domestic requirements. It's a function of, if you like, the domestic political forces. So what people do, and we're seeing that increasingly, is that sovereign interest drives, if you like, economic diplomacy and also your foreign policy. So I think that we should not be lamenting the fact that a major Western power has decided that we're pulling the plug on some of the aid. Of course, it's got devastating impacts on the lived experiences of the many, pushing back our quest to ensure that we are disease-free, those curable diseases can be attended to, investments in research. But when people resolve their own internal domestic problems, and that resulting in them pulling back on their international commitments, I think it's not sufficient just to lament. It's to find ways of how you respond in a manner that empowers you going into the future. Of course, in the short term is how best do you mitigate the adverse impact. But in the long term, it helps you to think creatively and differently about how you examine, understand, and resolve your own problems, that you must be less and less reliant on other external parties. I do accept that there's interconnectivity, there's integration in how the world organizes itself. So it will be naive or a height of folly for me to suggest that we'll be able to resolve challenges of our country and the region and the continent on our own. I think we need to collaborate, cement areas of solidarity with the rest of the world. But essentially, we've been told that we are on our own. So we need to find ways of how best we respond in a manner that still strengthens our belief that there has to be solidarity. By that I mean regions of the world need to collaborate to resolve problems of the world. That from time to time in the electoral cycle there might be setbacks from that agenda, but we must find ways of mitigating that and see how best we can respond. So I think that this Africa Energy Indaba provides us with a unique opportunity for us to reimagine what some of these interventions are and come out of this conference suggesting ways of how we can work with sovereign governments on the continent in ensuring that Africa is able to reclaim and occupy her rightful place in the community of regions across the globe. But thank you, Tsakani, for the opportunity.
Thank you very much for the valuable insights and the comprehensive summary of your earlier address. I would also just like to take this opportunity to indicate that we are also joined by our Deputy Minister, Ms. Samantha Graham Murray, who is on the other side of the room. And then, colleagues, as we indicated earlier, that this platform or this session really is for you to delve into more insights. So we will allow you an opportunity to ask questions, which will enable the Minister.
All right, let's come out of that briefing then by Electricity Minister Dr. Kgosientsho Ramokgopa, briefing the media there, just giving highlights of his earlier opening address, earlier giving an address there at the Africa Energy Indaba in Cape Town. It is the 17th Energy Indaba. Touching on some very key points there, drawing, of course, on concerns playing out geopolitically, including the issues of aid and trade matters. As part of outlining the energy landscape, the ministers talked about the country's commitment to energy security and sustainability. of course, comments coming through about South Africa's plans in terms of what to do for this country and as far as the energy crisis is concerned. He's also spoken with concern on the issues of the financing gap, and I think this is a big one in terms of just saying that this should be central to all the key discussions during this particular summit, saying that there is a need to reconfigure the cost of capital, especially as the debt burden is placed on developing countries, saying that this is rather crippling. Of course, we'll get analysis on just some of the things that have transpired during this particular briefing. One more point saying that the developing nations face high borrowing costs and that there is a need to work very hard to attract private sector investments in the energy space. Of course, discussions there that have been playing out for a very long time in this country in as far as that is concerned, but also calling on political stability as one of those key factors that are needed in order to get those investments for one. But we'll continue then to unpack his speech earlier on and also some of the discussions that are continuing during this particular Energy Indaba.